So welcome to this video. It's something of a recap on the last few weeks, really just bringing together everything that we've thought about around qualitative and mixed methods approaches in particular, and then moving on to thinking about how do we present that data in written form, how do we disseminate it, which is a really important part of the process of research. So over the last few weeks we've looked at lots of different things, and we've gone from paradigms, which are the philosophical ideas, through methodologies and methods. And that flow has really taken us from something which might be seen as quite abstract and conceptual, kind of philosophical, even metaphysical, when we're discussing paradigms, through to something that's increasingly concrete when we think about the methodology. We're thinking about planning for answering a very specific question. And when we get to the methods, then we're actually interacting probably with participants. We're going and we're viewing things. So there's very much a situatedness or a concrete nature to the latter parts. So we can see that flow from the conceptual down to the concrete. Just to recap, so on the paradigm, these are some words that hopefully you're kind of familiar with now. Things like voluntarism versus positivism, subjectivism versus objectivism, ontology and epistemology. So some of these words are working in parallel, in pairs. If you remember that whole question about the paradigm, what do we believe is knowledge? What do we believe is real? And those kind of questions, is it created by us, or is there something called knowledge that exists external to us? It's those kind of questions. And they're going to seat our research. And so having a sense of that is very important to begin with. Remember, we move through the different methodologies. There are lots of different ones. These are just a few. Remember, we have things like mixed methods or case study, ethnographic research, autoethnography was something else we discussed, narrative inquiry, and then we've also got action research there. Again, there are many other methodologies, but these are just the most popular ones. We have phenomenology, for instance, which isn't here, but we discussed. Finally, at the most concrete level, we have our methods. And again, we had a session on those. There's a video on these where we're thinking about all of the different ways that we can collect data. And each one of these types of data is going to work better or worse with a particular methodology, and will be more or less suitable for answering a particular question. So these are kind of like the three layers. They're kind of like the background of everything that we do for research. And then kind of moving forward, so we've now captured our data, let's say. What is it that we're going to do next? And this is our data analysis, which we've also looked at. And you'll remember that it's not that there's one approach to data analysis. It's not that somebody can say, hey, this is how you do it. There are ways, there are means. And I think this line at the bottom is really, really important. It comes from Cohen, Mannion and Morrison. How one does it should abide by the issues of fitness for purpose. And I think that's really, really critical. Our analysis and the purpose of it needs to fit with the question, with the approach. So there's no correct way, but there's something that's better or worse, possibly what's more appropriate in the given situation. Again, this is something else that we touched upon. This idea that actually there could well be multiple things happening simultaneously. So data collection can be happening at exactly the same time as data analysis. So it might be that we collect some initial data, and as we're analysing that, we start to realise that we need to collect data in a slightly different way or from a slightly different source. And at the same time, we've got this analysis and multiple interpretations happening as well. It's not that there's a singular way of analysing, but actually there are multiple interpretations of the data we've got because it's rich, and what we're looking for is analysis of that richness as much as anything. A lot of these different things come about because we're going to have different intentions with our research. And this is a list of different intentions. And you'll start to see how they're going to shape the type of analysis you do and your approach towards it. So if we're trying to describe something, the way that we collect data, our methods, our methodologies might well be very different to something where we're looking to generate a theme or discover patterns. That might require a slightly different approach, slightly different question, slightly different methods, slightly different methodologies. It's not that any of these also necessarily isolated from each other. So it could be, if we think about mixed methods, that at first we're trying to discover something and then we're going to look to dig deeply into it. So it might be that at different phases of your research, your intentions are different, and that can be part of a process. So it could be that we run a process for so long, trying to get some core data, and then we deepen it, or perhaps we start off with a deep survey and then we look to see if that's generalizable. Remember that there's something really important about qualitative data, which is that it doesn't have to involve huge data sets. The depth doesn't come from interviewing hundreds of people. It comes from the depth of the interview and the depth of our analysis of an interview with an individual, for instance, or from a single observation, but it's about the depth of what we observe and how we interpret what we observe. So it's the detail as opposed to having a large set. That means we've got to be really careful. It's very easy with qualitative data to get huge amounts of it. So we've got to be really careful about selecting what's really important to answer our question and not over collecting. There's this idea of progressive focusing, which is there at the bottom, which is that, again, part of this kind of spiral idea we discussed earlier, that actually as you collect your data, what you might want to do is to narrow in. So we narrow in as we're collecting our data, and this is called progressive focusing. We've discussed these as well. These are challenges in data analysis. One is that we're going to order and sort that data. What do we think is relevant? Well, how do we judge what's relevant? That's going to be based to some extent on our personal bias. Even things like our question selection is going to be based on our bias, on our positionality. Why do we want to ask question A and somebody else might prefer to ask question B? That's based on a personal bias. So even the question itself and our choice of our research is bias. So we need to recognize that. The second part is this idea of the fact that we're constantly interpreting interpretations. If you remember, we had this idea of a double hermeneutic, this idea that when we're interpreting, we're not interpreting from a first position. We're interpreting very often from a second position. If somebody's told us something about an event, they've already interpreted it. So we have this issue as well, that essentially it's fictions upon fictions. So how do we get to something that is real or true? So these are some of the challenges that we're going to face if we're using qualitative data. And then just moving forward again, so we're thinking about it in terms of very concrete things. We looked at how we analyze text, and a lot of our data is going to get turned into text. As you can see here, here's an example of kind of coding essentially. Somebody's using different colored pens to highlight things that mean different things. And you'll remember from our coding session, or our session when we looked at analysis, there are different types of analysis that we want to think about. Things like thematic or content narrative analysis, narrative or discourse analysis. There's more about those in the other videos. And again, if there's an area that you're interested in or that you're going to use, for instance, let's say you're going to do content analysis, do go away and do some additional reading about exactly how content analysis works. So we've done our analysis, we've collected our data, we've got our methodology worked out, and we know what paradigm we're in. The next thing we need to do as we start to analyze, and probably towards the end of our analysis process, is to begin to write things up. And the first place we're going to write things up in is our results section. And the key thing about this is that this section, where we understand there is a level of interpretation throughout anything like this, the purpose of this is not to analyze, really, not to be interpreting the data, but to be presenting it as dispassionately as possible. It's just saying, this is what I've collected. I've ordered it and I've sorted it, but this is what it is. And I'm going to do the analysis of it later. I'm just showing you it so that you can get a sense on what I've discovered. I want to just think about how we present that though, because there are different ways, and this comes from Cohen and Mannion, and they talk about 7 different ways. I'm going to skip through these quite quickly. The first one is by group. So let's say that we're interviewing different groups of people, then we might do that presentation by the different groups we talk to. We talk to some parents, we talk to some students, we talk to some teachers, let's say. So we would present it by those different groups. Or perhaps it's who we observed. We observed some choir lessons, so we'll talk about the choir lessons we observed. Perhaps we observed one-to-one teaching, and so we talk about that separately. So it's thinking about the groups that we observed or we spoke to. We could do it by individuals. This is particularly good if we're doing interviews. So again, we talk about the individual who we talk to, and then we talk to this individual, and then we interview this other individual, and we can present the data that way. Themes. I think for me, this tends to be a slightly stronger way of doing it, but it's immediately taking us closer to the analysis. But probably you've got that already because you're going to be chunking your data up probably according to code. So you're going to start to have some themes emerging. And this is the third one. This is probably my preferred way of seeing papers written because you start to get a sense of what's emerging, what are the themes. We might want to do it by research question. It's possible that you've got an overarching question and then you've got 2 or 3 sub-questions. And one way of presenting this data is to analyse it by question. What's really key, however we analyse and show our findings, is that we're constantly referring back to that question. We need to make sure that we're not just presenting random data, but that all of the data, all of our research findings relate to that question. We might do it by tool or instrument. So let's say that you've done some observations of some lessons. Perhaps you did some interviews and perhaps you did a survey. Another way of presenting that data would be to show it by tool. So put all of your interviews together, all of your observations together, all of your survey data together. By case study, this is less likely for us, but sometimes you might want to present it via a series of case studies. This might be used if you're doing a multiple case study approach for your methodology. I think it's unlikely that we'll be using that, but just be aware that this is one way that you could do it. And next, it's possible to do it chronologically. Very often this is the case if you're doing something like action research, where you've gone through a series of cycles. It might also make sense if during your research you've had phases. So even if you're doing something like a case study or a phenomenology, it might be that you've essentially had different stages where you've got stage 1 and you've done, I don't know, some observations or some interviews or something. And then that's led you to reframe perhaps your research question or to reframe the types of questions you're asking people or the types of things you're looking for. And at that point, it might make sense because of the process you've been through to present your findings chronologically to explain the process of collecting that data along with the data itself. So these are all of the core ways that you might think about writing up your findings. However, it's also possible that you might need to mix certain things together. So it might be that you've found 4 or 5 overarching themes, and then the best way to highlight those themes is to separate each theme out by tool. So you're going to say, okay, we're exploring the issue of, let's say, motivation. And then you've got some interviews and some observations. So you'll present that separate data about motivation from each of those different tools that you've used, those methods that you've used. And then perhaps you've got something about parental engagement or parental role in teaching and learning. And so then perhaps that's part of your research. You'd present those findings by theme again. So parental engagement would be the theme, and then by the tools that you've used to find that data as well. So you can mix these things together. Okay, so you've written your findings up. It's dispassionate and you've just kind of hinted at things. Perhaps you've quoted bits of interviews. You've said what you've observed and why it's important. Well, less about why it's important, but you've just presented it is the key thing here. The next thing you need to do is to get into your discussion. And you start to ask questions like, why did you get the results? What does it mean? How does it compare to existing knowledge? Very often for me, I think of this almost like a literature review, like a second literature review. You're going to say, okay, I found this. What does it mean? Does this align with the theory that I wrote about in my literature review? It might require you to go away and to find some additional literature. Perhaps you've discovered something that you weren't expecting in your literature review, something new. So you're going to go away and you're going to look into, has anybody else seen this happen before? So very often it's like writing a second literature review, but with your findings embedded in it. But you're going to be asking yourself a question, well, why and what does it mean? I think these are the critical things. You're analysing and you're synthesising. This is very often where a large chunk of the grades come from at this level of work. And it's also the really important thing. Essentially what we're saying here is, have we discovered something new? Have we created some knowledge? That's what we're looking for in this discussion. But it's really important that we're not just going, hey, I found this, it's really amazing. We need to be going, hey, I found this. What does it mean? Is my data solid? Are there reasons why my data might not be solid? Are there things that I need to consider, refine? Are there different perspectives on my data? So all of these different things need to be talked about. Okay, so you've written your sections. Once you've done that, you've essentially got your report written. But what I'd like to show you here is this is an overview of what you might expect to see typically in a research report. This is the style, the form that most research comes in if you go to a journal. It might differ a little bit, and for different subjects it will look different. So if you're looking more performing arts rather than performing arts education, you might see a slightly freer type of layout. But typically in music education you're going to have something like this. You're going to have an abstract. And the purpose of the abstract is really to say, hey, you found this paper, this is what I'm going to discuss. These are kind of like the core sentence about what my findings are. And the idea here is that somebody who's interested in doing research related to yours can go, is this paper relevant to me? Should I spend half an hour or an hour reading it? Or actually is it going to be irrelevant to my interests? So that's how we pitch that abstract, is to help other people to find your work and go, yes, I need to read this, or no, I don't think I do. Our introduction, that tends to be our positionality statement, saying why we're doing this and kind of the context of the research. Then we get into our literature review. This is very much kind of things that you've been writing up until now. We start to build a framework, a theoretical framework for us to work from. So we're going to be thinking about who else has written in similar areas, perhaps the type of themes or types of issues we imagine might come up, what's been written about them, how does this subject, this question, how is it perceived right now from the literature that we can get our hands on. So that's the point. And the other really key thing here with a literature review is to say what's not known. So it's important to get to the end of the papers you're reading and to look at the end part where they're saying, this research went so far, but, and it's the but which is really important. All papers will say, have a but at some point and go, further research needs to be done on this, or this is hinting at this, but. And it's those kind of things. So our literature review needs to recognize kind of where our knowledge runs out. It's like almost a Socratic thing. If you know about Socratic questioning, it's that thing of how far can you push an idea until it just stops working, until there's no solid evidence. And that's what we're looking for. So it's what's known, but equally important, the validity of the statements and where those statements start to run out. And hopefully our research kind of picks up on those threads and adds to the end point. The next thing is the methodology. We've talked a lot about this. This will include things. You might briefly talk about the paradigm you're working in, but you're not going to do that in so much detail. However, you will talk in detail about your methodology, about your methods, your analysis approach. You'll talk about ethics. Really think about this as a recipe. If somebody wanted to recreate your research, what is it that they would have to do? How would they go about it? So it's really that kind of replicability issue here. We talk about our methodology. Somebody else could literally pick up a paper, read it and go, oh, okay, well, I've got to go and find 2 different groups of students and I'm going to do focus groups with them, and these are the kind of questions I'm going to ask. That's the information that kind of happens in your methodology. Next we have our results. We talked about that just now, that dispassionate showing of data. Then we get to the discussion. The discussion is the really meaty bit, it's the pithy bit. As we said, it's kind of essentially almost like a second literature review, but this time we're seeing that literature theoretical framework from the stance of the data you've collected. That's the lens we're viewing that literature in. Does it align? Does it challenge? Are you finding weaknesses in current theory? Perhaps you've just added a little bit of new knowledge onto the end, or perhaps you think you have from what you've found out. And then finally, we get our conclusions. This is the summary. This is where we say, hey, we think we found this out. And that's really important. This is normally quite short. It'll only be possibly 3 or 4 paragraphs. And important in here is that we recognize in our conclusion the weakness. So we're normally saying our research is hinting at this. Very rarely, and typically nobody does this. So I found this amazing thing. It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant. It's going to be paradigm changing. Nobody does that. Everybody's very tentative around their findings when they produce research. They're saying, hey, this is what I found. These are what I think are the potential weaknesses. These are all the ways that you can attack it. And I'm going to tell you what they are before you think of them. So that I show that I recognize that my research is weak in these ways. And then you can go on and say, actually, future research could do this and this and this. Based on my findings, this is where I would go next. These are the interesting areas. These are the things that have come up that I'm not sure about or that are being hinted at, and things that people should consider for future research. So that's really the point of that conclusion. And when you've tied all of that together, you've got your final research report. And that could be your master's thesis, or equally, it could be a paper that you submit to an academic journal. And we've had people do that in the past, and it might be something that you consider as you're writing your work. Is there a journal where you might want to publish? Because it would be a good next step. Okay, there's one task that I would like you to do, and I'll give that to you now. I would like you to go and find an academic research paper. And again, I would like you to go back through it. I might have asked you to do this before already. But I would like you to go back through that research paper now, and I would like you to look at each of these sections. They might not have exactly the same titles, but there's going to be something that's very similar, even if it's titled slightly differently. So think about what that research is. Think about how it's written up. I want you to think about the language being used in the research paper. How's it written? What's the language being used? Are they talking from a first-person perspective, saying I? Or are they talking about the researcher? So how do they put that information across? Think about how they build their arguments, how they're using headings and subheadings. Really just get into the feel of the paper. This is really kind of, it's a bit like if you hear Bach and you hear some chorales or something, kind of understanding orally what's going on. We're now used to that. Hopefully we're already used to that because we've been reading some academic papers. But now we're taking the next step. Now this is a bit like suddenly learning about figured harmony, figured bass, or 4-part writing. It's at this moment that we're going to start looking slightly differently. I want you to be sort of analysing and be analytical about what it is that makes an academic paper as opposed to a newspaper article or an article in a different form. So that's your task. Go away, find a paper, and analyse it through the lens of these different things. See how they're put together, see how that methodology is talked about, how it links to the literature review, see if there's a golden thread with that research question going all the way through. As ever, here are some references. Not so many here, really. Conan Mannion is brilliant in this regard, so that's mostly what I've picked up on here. So I would suggest go and find that book if you're interested in writing up. But most of the core texts, most of the core textbooks on research and education research will have a section on writing up and dissemination. So go away, do some more reading, and hopefully this is interesting and has got you just to get that wider perspective again. So we've looked at detail and lots of things, and hopefully this has just kind of helped you to mesh it together somewhat. And I shall see you very soon. Thank you. Bye.